Pueblo, Colorado. A city where the desert meets the mountains, where winds sweep through old streets lined with stories both ordinary and extraordinary. But in 2018, tucked away in a modest home on the city's south side, two children, Yennia and Jesus Jr., were quietly living out their short lives. They laughed, they dreamed, they played, and they mattered. This isn't just the story of a crime. It's a story of remembrance. Because behind the headlines, behind the courtroom transcripts and legal arguments, there were two children who deserved so much more. Tonight, we honor them by telling their story, not as a case file, but as a human tragedy that must never be forgotten. Imagine Yennia, curious, thoughtful, often found holding onto her favorite stuffed toy. And Jesus Jr., playful, always on the move, his laughter echoing through the yard. They were children whose lives should have stretched decades into the future. Instead, their light was extinguished far too soon, and for years their absence remained hidden. What follows is both heartbreaking and haunting. It's the unraveling of a terrible secret, the fight for truth, and the reminder that behind every crime statistic are names, faces, and little souls who deserve to be remembered. In the summer of 2024, Pueblo police received a call that would change everything. It wasn't a typical missing persons report, nor was it a routine welfare check. Instead, it was a grim tip-off. Evidence suggested that the remains of two children, long thought to be missing, could be hidden in a storage unit. Detectives arrived at the unit on the edge of town, their footsteps heavy with anticipation. As the door creaked open, the heat from the enclosed space rushed out. What they found inside silenced even the most seasoned officers. There, amid boxes and forgotten belongings, were the remains of Yennia and Jesus Jr. After 6 long years, the truth had finally surfaced. Later, just days after this grim discovery, investigators uncovered another chilling detail. An abandoned car registered to their mother had been sitting untouched for years, serving as another silent witness to what had been concealed. For Pueblo, this wasn't just a news story. It was a wound reopened. For the children, it was the beginning of justice. Justice delayed but not denied. And yet, as the world learned of this discovery, a deeper truth lingered in the air. Why had it taken so long? How could two innocent children vanish, only to be discovered years later in such a manner? As investigators began to pull apart the tangled history behind this case, they didn't just uncover a crime. They uncovered a story of betrayal, silence, and missed chances, moments when anyone could have intervened. But before we delve into the darkness, we must pause here. Because even in telling the story of their disappearance, Yennia and Jesus Jr. deserve more than to be remembered as remains in a storage unit. They were children with birthdays, with favorite foods, with inside jokes that only siblings share. When the detectives zipped up the evidence bags, they weren't just sealing the case file. They were closing a chapter of silence. And for the first time in years, these children were no longer lost. To truly understand this case, we must return to 2018, the year when Yennia and Jesus Jr. were last seen alive. Back then, neighbors occasionally glimpsed them playing in the small yard outside their home. Yennia loved to draw, her notebooks filled with sketches and doodles. Jesus Jr. was fascinated by bikes, often watching older kids ride past, hoping one day to have one of his own. But beneath these snapshots of innocence, there were shadows. Teachers sometimes noted their absence in school, long gaps that didn't seem to have a clear explanation. Welfare checks were inconsistent. And behind closed doors, life was unraveling in ways no one could see. For children like Yennia and Jesus Jr., the world can become very small. Their safety depended entirely on the adults around them, adults who, tragically, would fail them. We often think of crimes as single events, a single act of violence, a single moment of betrayal. But in truth, this tragedy was years in the making. It was silence layered upon silence, absence piled upon absence, until finally, their voices were completely gone. In 2018, Pueblo didn't know what was missing. But classrooms knew. Friends who asked, "Where are they?" knew. And in their absence, the world grew just a little darker. The hardest part of this story isn't just the crime itself, it's the silence that followed. After 2018, no official reports placed Yennia and Jesus Jr. in public spaces. Their names stopped appearing in school rolls, their faces faded from the playground. Yet their disappearance went unnoticed by systems designed to protect children. It's here we must pause to honor the weight of that silence. Every year that passed without answers was a year their memory dimmed in the public eye. Birthdays came and went without candles or cake. Christmas mornings arrived without gifts. And still no one asked loudly enough, "Where are Yennia and Jesus Jr.?" Investigators later pieced together what happened during those years. Their guardians continued to receive welfare benefits as though the children were alive. Paperwork was filed. Boxes were checked. On paper, Yennia and Jesus Jr. still existed. But in reality, their voices had already been silenced. For many, this was the most painful part of the story, not just that two children were gone, but that for years their absence was hidden beneath layers of fraud and neglect. It raises uncomfortable questions. How many systems failed? How many warning signs were ignored? And how could such silence endure for so long in a community where children should have been cherished? By 2023, whispers began to surface. The story their guardians told wasn't holding together. Inconsistencies began to appear, details that didn't match, paperwork that contradicted itself. Neighbors asked questions. Relatives grew suspicious. And soon law enforcement started to take notice. Behind every crime lies a moment of unraveling, a point where lies can no longer sustain the weight of truth. For this case, it was the small details, the contradictions, the forgotten explanations, that finally drew investigators closer. But let us pause again here before diving deeper into the mechanics of the investigation. By late 2023, Pueblo detectives were tired of half-truths. The guardians of Yennia and Jesus Jr. had given story after story, excuses, explanations, even false leads. But small cracks had started to form. Dates didn't line up. Official records contradicted each other. Investigators began quietly pulling threads, and soon the entire fabric began to unravel. Neighbors recalled long stretches where they hadn't seen the children. Months, even years. One relative admitted they hadn't spoken to them since 2018. And as more people came forward, a chilling reality took shape. No one could confirm that Yennia or Jesus Jr. were alive. The silence was deafening. It's here that our story pauses, not in the interrogation room but in imagination. Because if this absence had been noticed in 2018, perhaps Pueblo would have gathered sooner. Picture it, a candlelight vigil on a cool autumn night. Parents standing shoulder to shoulder, children holding flickering candles with wax dripping onto their small hands, their faces illuminated in soft orange glow. Neighbors whispering prayers, pastors offering comfort, and the children's photos clipped to poster boards. That vigil never happened in 2018. But it should have. Their absence should have sounded alarms, their disappearance should have shaken the city. Instead, their memory was left to fade quietly into silence, until detectives forced the truth to surface years later. The unraveling truth led detectives directly to the guardians who had been responsible for Yennia and Jesus Jr. as care. When confronted, their explanations fractured further. One claimed the children had been sent away. Another insisted they were safe but couldn't provide proof. Each answer only deepened suspicion. Police pressed harder. The weight of 6 years of silence was finally collapsing under the light of investigation. And soon it became undeniable, the guardians were lying. The arrests came swiftly. Pueblo police placed the adults in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of defiance and resignation. For law enforcement, this was progress. For the city, it was heartbreak. Outside the station, news of the arrests spread quickly. Community members who had never known Yennia or Jesus Jr. personally began to speak their names for the first time. Their photos, once hidden away in case files, now appeared on local news broadcasts. Pueblo was finally remembering them. And here again, imagine what might have been if their disappearance had been recognized sooner. Their names printed on flyers, taped to telephone poles, handed out at supermarkets. Search parties combing the streets. Volunteers with flashlights sweeping through parks. Instead, the community's chance to fight for them had been stolen by lies and paperwork. Even in the interrogation rooms, as the adults stumbled over their own stories, the real voices missing were those of Yennia and Jesus Jr. Children who could never testify, never explain, never cry out for help again. In the months that followed, the case against the guardians grew stronger. Evidence mounted. Witnesses testified. And yet, in court, a painful reality emerged. One of the accused agreed to a plea deal, trading testimony for a lighter sentence. This deal sparked outrage for many. How could someone tied to such a terrible crime walk away with reduced time? The answer lies in the cold calculations of the justice system. Without their testimony, securing full convictions might have been impossible. But this is where justice feels uneven. Because while adults negotiated in courtrooms, the children's fate had already been sealed years before. There was no bargaining for Yennia and Jesus Jr. No plea deal could return their lives. Picture this. If the community had known, vigils might have filled courthouse steps even then. Parents clutching signs that read "Justice for Yennia and Jesus Jr." children leaving flowers at the base of the courthouse doors. Strangers bowing their heads, demanding more than technical deals and reduced sentences. But in reality, the courtrooms were quiet. The children's names echoed only in legal documents, their memories folded into arguments over time served. And then, in 2024, something finally shifted. After the remains were discovered in that storage unit, Pueblo could no longer ignore what had been hidden. News cameras arrived. Reporters spoke their names aloud. And for the first time, Yennia and Jesus Jr. were remembered publicly, not as silent absences, but as children who had lived and deserved better. Community members organized vigils that year. Candles lined the steps of local churches. Flowers were left at playgrounds. Children who never knew them released balloons into the sky, watching as they drifted toward the horizon, whispering prayers into the evening wind. At one gathering, a pastor read aloud the words, "Every child deserves to be seen. Every child deserves to be loved." Tonight, we remember Yennia and Jesus Jr. not as a case, not as evidence, but as children of Pueblo, our children. It was too late to save them, but not too late to honor them. And perhaps that's where the heart of this story lies, not in the crime, not even in the trial, but in the way a community finally came together to ensure these two young souls were no longer invisible. Before we continue into the trial and the fight for justice, I want to pause here. If you believe, like I do, that every child deserves to be remembered, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a story and give this video a like. It helps keep these children's memories alive. When the case finally reached the courtroom in 2024, Pueblo braced itself. This was not just another trial, it was the reckoning for 6 years of silence. Prosecutors laid out the timeline: the children last seen in 2018, the welfare fraud that kept their names alive on paper, the lies told to family, and finally, the grim discovery of their remains in a storage unit. Jurors listened intently. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others wiped away tears as photos of Yennia and Jesus Jr. appeared on the screen. Smiling school portraits, snapshots that captured their innocence, now presented as evidence in a case about their deaths. Witnesses took the stand. Neighbors spoke of suspicions they had kept quiet. Teachers recalled the moment they realized the children had stopped coming to class. And then came the hardest testimonies, the accounts of investigators who had opened that storage unit, who had seen firsthand the truth that no one wanted to believe. But in the courtroom there was also silence. No crying voices of Yennia or Jesus Jr., no chance for them to tell their own story. Instead, others spoke for them, trying to stitch together their final chapters from fragments of evidence and memory. Outside, Pueblo gathered. On courthouse steps, people left teddy bears, candles, and flowers. Strangers embraced, saying the children's names as though they were their own. For a city that had once overlooked their absence, Pueblo was now determined not to overlook their memory. After weeks of arguments, the jury returned with their verdicts. Guilty. The guardians who had lied, concealed, and profited from silence would now face the consequences. Years in prison, though for many no sentence could ever feel equal to the lives lost. During sentencing, the judge's voice carried heavy weight. This court cannot undo the past. It cannot bring back Yennia and Jesus Jr., but it can send a message that silence, deception, and betrayal of children will not go unanswered. The gavel fell. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been delivered. Yet in the community, the verdict brought only partial peace. Some asked, why did it take so long? Others wondered, how many children like Yennia and Jesus Jr. are still slipping through the cracks? Justice in a courtroom cannot erase the birthdays missed, the laughter silenced, the future stolen. But it can acknowledge the truth, and in doing so, give the children back their voices and memory. At the conclusion of the trial, family members stood outside, holding framed photos of Yennia and Jesus Jr. They spoke quietly to reporters. They were beautiful children. They deserved better. We just want people to remember them. And in that moment, justice and remembrance walked hand in hand. As we reflect on this painful trial, I want to remind you, if you believe in keeping these children's memories alive, please subscribe to the channel. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a story like this, and hit that like button. It helps spread their names and their legacy far beyond Pueblo. The case of Yennia and Jesus Jr. is not just a Pueblo story. It's a reminder of how systems fail, how silence can stretch on, and how children can slip between the cracks. In Colorado and across the United States, similar tragedies have surfaced. Cases where children disappeared for months or years before anyone asked the right questions. Each story adds to a painful pattern, that sometimes the most vulnerable are the least protected. Experts warn that welfare fraud, missed school attendance and unchecked family claims are red flags. And in this case, each of those signs was present. But still, nothing was done until it was far too late. And so, the legacy of this case isn't just about a conviction. It's about responsibility. Teachers, neighbors, relatives, and systems must all remember, silence is not safety. Absence must always be questioned. Because behind every unchecked absence could be another Yennia, another Jesus Jr. But alongside those lessons lies a deeper truth: remembrance. Communities must remember the children lost not just as victims, but as lives worth celebrating. Their laughter, their dreams, their innocence must not vanish into case files. This is where tributes, vigils, and public memory matter most. For when a child is remembered, they live on, not in silence but in the voices of those who refuse to forget. In the weeks after the trial, Pueblo came together in ways it hadn't before. Outside a local church, hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil in honor of Yennia and Jesus Jr. Children from nearby schools sang softly, their voices carried by the night breeze. Parents held their own kids close, whispering reminders of love and protection. Candles flickered in the dark, each flame a small act of defiance against the silence that had once concealed the truth. At the center of it all, two photos rested on easels: Yennia's smiling school portrait and Jesus Jr. with his bright, eager grin. Around them, flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes piled high. Messages like "You are not forgotten" and "Fly high, sweet angels" filled the space. A pastor's words cut through the hush: "We gather tonight not just in grief but in commitment. We will not forget Yennia and Jesus Jr. We will not let their story fade into silence. We will speak their names. We will carry their memory." And as the crowd released balloons into the night sky, voices whispered together, "Yennia, Jesus Jr." They were children who lived. They were children who mattered. And Pueblo had finally given them the tribute they deserved. If you've stayed with us this far, it means this story matters to you too. Please, subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon, and give this video a like. Together, we can ensure stories like Yennia and Jesus Jr.'s are never forgotten. Tonight, we've walked through one of Pueblo's darkest chapters. We've seen how silence can conceal tragedy, how systems can fail, and how justice, though delayed, can finally emerge. But above all, we've remembered Yennia and Jesus Jr. not as headlines, not as statistics, but as children. Children with dreams, laughter, and lives worth honoring. Their story is a warning. But it is also a call. A call to ask harder questions, to notice when voices go silent, to fight for children who cannot fight for themselves. And it's a call to remember. Because as long as we speak their names, they are never truly gone. So tonight, as this story closes, I'll leave you with this. What responsibility do we each hold in protecting the most vulnerable? How can communities come together sooner so no child slips away unnoticed? And how can we, as viewers and storytellers, make sure that Yennia and Jesus Jr. are remembered not just for how they were lost, but for who they were? Take a moment in the quiet after this video to whisper their names. Light a candle if you can. Carry their memory forward. Because children should be remembered for how they lived, not only for how their lives were taken.